So learning is important to us as employees and as managers because learning helps shape how we think about our environment and can also help shape our behaviour. So if we want to be able to change people's behaviour, learning is a key strategy for actually doing that. So let's dive into a couple of different theories of learning and think about how we can use them to explain or help change people's behaviours. So when we think about learning, what we're talking about is a change in behaviour that occurs as a result of some experience. So in a classroom setting, this might be a change in knowledge that you have that then would be able to translate into a different type of behaviour. On the job, you might have particular experiences that you then interpret, help shape your perceptions, result in shifts in attitudes, and you could use that as a way of thinking about how you might learn to change your behaviours as a consequence of those experiences. So we have this idea of operant conditioning, which is a fairly old school idea that comes from behavioralism, which is a sort of one of the early and fairly standard forms of psychology, which is where we would try and understand people's psychology based on their behavior. So the classic example of this is something like the Pavlov's dog experiment, where, if you haven't heard about that, the guy called Pavlov was able to set up a operant condition. So he was able to essentially train his dog that every time he rang a bell, he would give the dog food. And as a consequence, the dog was conditioned. So it learned over time from that operation of the bell ringing and being given food, that it learnt that ringing a bell meant I'm going to get food. And so what then happened was every time Pavlov rang the bell, the dog would salivate because it was expecting food. And so this is a classic example of this idea that behavior is a function of consequences. So when the bell is rung, the consequence is that I expect food, and so I salivate if I'm Pavlov's dog. Some other ways of thinking about learning, though, we have this idea of what we call social learning theory, which is that people learn through observation and a direct experience, and they learn from others. And so there's a set of processes that, to whatever degree, can play an influence on the way in which people learn through others. So the first of this is what we call attentional processes. So these are the things that either you pay attention to or are drawn to your attention. So examples like this, of this might be in a workplace. You might have things like put up on the walls, like reminders of, say, safety things that you have to be aware of. And the purpose of those things being on the wall is to draw your attention to them, so that they're in your face and you are constantly looking at them and reminded of them. There's also retention processes. So similar example to the one I just said, you might have those posters on the wall might be set up in a way that's memorable. So they might use an acronym that helps you remember whatever that information is, or be written in such a way that it's not complicated, and so it's easy to then remember. So say, for example, if you've ever learned how to do CPR, they use a lot of abbreviations. And I remember when I was taught, how to do CPR, I was taught to do it to the rhythm of Staying Alive, as a way to help me remember how often to do those compressions. So it was used as a memory aid to help me retain that information. Motor reproduction processes is where you learn through doing. So again, using the example of trying to teach someone how to do CPR, it's one thing to have them watch how to do those compressions. That's important to be able to demonstrate it so they learn cognitively, but getting them to actually do that process themselves will result in them both remembering what they need to do, but also learning that process. So not all things involve mode of reproduction, but generally speaking, the more we can involve the body, the more that we're actually going to learn whatever it is we're trying to learn. And then we have reinforcement processes. So these are things that either help us by encouraging us to learn whatever it is that we're trying to learn, or negative reinforcement, which is where we're trying to prevent us from either continuing to do something or trying to encourage us to do something different. And we'll dive into these next. So as a manager, there's a few ways that you can help shape people's behavior. And so if we think about these first two around positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, people often think about this as ways of helping shape their children's behavior or maybe pets' behavior. And you might use positive reinforcement, which is what we would think of as rewarding good behavior. So as a manager, if someone does something great, you might smile, you might say thank you, you might, I don't know, high five them, you might give them a gift certificate as a way of reinforcing and telling them that what you did was great, do it again. So we're helping shape behavior and we're helping them learn by going, oh, we internalize that then and go, okay, this is what I should be doing. This was a good thing. I'll continue to do more of it. And so we're actually training people and shaping their behavior in that way. Negative reinforcement is where we, it's not quite punishment, but we are dissuading them from continuing to do whatever it is that they've done. So this could be as simple as frowning or kind of saying no. So if somebody does something that we don't want them to continue to do, we would give them some form of negative reinforcement. So it might be in the form of saying, please don't do that again. And we might use a tone of voice or something that is sending the message to them that what they've done, we don't want them to do it again. And so we're using that form of negative reinforcement to help shape their behavior and to help them learn what it is that we're wanting them to do, or in this case, to not do. Then punishment is a kind of next level of negative reinforcement where we're actually providing a consequence for something that we don't want to happen. So this can be, you know, being sent to your room, or in the case of a workplace, you might get some kind of, I don't know, you might get sent home, you might get some kind of reprimand. So there's actually a greater consequence than just the negative reinforcement. And then extinction is, it's kind of almost like a level down of these, where we're not necessarily reinforcing or not reinforcing, but we're just not validating. So the example that they talk about in the book is where if you have someone who constantly pesters you for information, you might just ignore them, right? They might send you an email where they're asking for something and you just ignore it. And so in some ways it's a form of negative reinforcement because it's sort of telling them to not do it. But essentially what will happen over time is that they'll do that behavior less and less because they're not getting the payoff or they're not getting what they want. So they'll try something else instead. So I guess it's a more passive form of that reinforcement type technique. So next, what we'll finish off with is a couple of issues that are considered to be more current and more modern things that have emerged in the area of organisational behaviour. And that's the two topics of generational differences and bullying.